I think that what Bangladesh has done with the youth movement is to teach the rest of the world that resistance is possible even in the most oppressive of regimes. How can you talk about a democracy that says you have to have discrimination?
Yeah. Viewers, welcome to TV Metro Mail. You are watching Chit Chat, and I am Emamul Haque with you. Today, I am very delighted. I am pleased to have my very special guest. Today, I am joined by Professor Henry Giroux. First, let me just bring him on screen, then we'll have some chat with him. Professor Henry, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
It's our pleasure, and we will be today discussing about the fascism, particularly the cultural fascism. But before going into that, let me introduce to my audience about you very briefly. Viewers, Professor Henry is one of the world's most influential cultural critics and public intellectuals. He is the McMaster University Chair for Scholarship in the Public Interest. He teaches English and cultural studies there. And Professor Henry is a world-renowned cultural critic and public intellectual whose work on democracy, education, and social justice has inspired people across the globe. Please join me in welcoming Professor Henry. Professor Henry, thank you very much once again for joining us.
Oh, you bet.
Basically, we want to understand the nature of, the character of fascism, particularly the cultural fascism, in relation to recent change in Bangladesh and student uprising due to different issues that we probably will be discussing in our show. So we like to start with that, since you have a special interest on cultural studies, cultural fascism. I have gone through a number of your articles. I found that you have described culture as a battlefield. How do authoritarian regimes turn this culture into a weapon?
Well, I think that what we need to realize is that when you talk about culture, you're not just you have to begin by recognizing that domination is not simply economic. There are also forms of domination that are, to say the very least, pedagogical and lie on the side of belief and persuasion. And I think that if you recognize that culture is a site where identities are formed, values are shaped, people in some way learn how to talk to each other, how we come to remember and fear and forget, culture becomes, in a sense, a powerful form of social engineering, a force for shaping memory, identity, and collective agency. And I think that what people don't realize is that it's a pedagogical tool. And that by pointing to culture, what becomes clear is that education becomes central to politics itself. This is particularly important at a time when matters of power, culture, everyday life, and new technologies now fuse to really make culture a central site, not only of domination, but also a site of resistance, a site where agencies are formed, narratives are produced, and public discourse is often engineered, shaped, and in some way catered to the forces of power.
As a general people, if they want to understand the fascism or cultural fascism, what are the clearest sign of cultural fascism that people anywhere in the world should be alert to? What are the signs?
I think that the sign, it's funny, being a particular critic of the United States, which has always operated under the myth of being a democracy, we now see a playbook being implemented there that is really kind of central to authoritarian countries across the globe. And what we have first is we have a language of dehumanization, a language that often excludes certain groups, whether they're young people who are protesting, women, minorities. We also have an attack on memory. We have often a support for a mythic past, a cult of the leader, ultra-nationalism, a kind of racial cleansing, the destruction of public goods, the privatization, commodification of almost everything. But what we really see in the most overt way is the control of the media, by corporate and political forces. You see the repression of dissent. You see an attack on historical memory. You see the banning of books. You see the banning of critical ideas. You see an attack on education and a really fierce repressive attempt to fire dissidents or crush opposition. And what's important to recognize here is that what we see in these countries is not just simply an attack on critical ideas, not just simply an attack on critical individuals, but an attack on the institutions that support them. Whether we're talking about Orban's Hungary, or we're talking about Bangladesh, or we're talking about the United States, what you see is an attack on education, an attack on the media, an attack on the oppositional press, an attack on all those spaces that provide a public narrative that holds power accountable.
So you talked about the public narrative and attack on media, institution, educational institution, all. So these are the common sign for a fascist ruler. In Bangladesh, the ruling powers, they often rewrite or suppress part of the history or the whole history. Is this the textbook example of cultural fascism?
It's really a great question, and thank you for asking it. Because it seems to me that the war on history is a war on democracy. Social amnesia, historical amnesia, is really fundamental to authoritarian regimes. Because what they want to do is they want to eradicate elements of the collective past for controlling how we think, how we understand in the past certain challenges that have been made to authority, how in some ways we can understand forms of resistance that we can learn from. And what it does, what historical amnesia does, what this attack on memory does, it erases narratives that point to historically rooted forms of oppression, forms of resistance. In this case, history becomes dangerous because it offers the tool for moral meanings, political alternatives, and collective resistance. It offers us ways to understand the present and understand the future in ways that don't have to replicate the present. It helps us to understand forces of domination that have existed in the past that are trying to be erased, that need to be addressed, and in some way need to be fought. So in that sense, history becomes enormously powerful as a way of thinking against power, of thinking against repression, thinking against particular forms of domination rooted in belief and rooted in forms of consent.
This is what we see, that every ruling government, if they have the fascist character in mind, they just try to alter or suppress the history.
They alter the history because they understand something. They understand that history is dangerous. Foucault talked about dangerous memories. Memory can be dangerous. I mean, memories, in a sense, challenge their mythic understanding of the past, challenges their normalization of domination, challenges this notion that the cult of the leader is universal, challenges the notion that justice is not something that should be fought for, and in a sense gives birth to the breath of democracy. Democracy cannot exist without informed citizens. It doesn't exist. Democracy cannot exist in the land of ignorance. Democracy cannot exist under the threat and the process and the practice of historical amnesia. And in that sense, the fight for memory is the fight for democracy.
Yeah. And apart from the history, I think the nationalism and religion is very important part, and they are playing very strong role in politics in many countries, including Bangladesh. So how can these two things, the nationalism and religion, manipulate to control the society?
I think that what we have to understand about nationalism is nationalism operates in the world of barriers. It operates in the world of exclusions. It operates in the world of militarization. It shuts down differences. It becomes a vehicle for racial cleansing in a host of religious and economic fundamentalisms. And it seems, in a sense, in the most historical sense, it leads to political violence. It leads, in a sense, to claiming that some people are worthy and some people are not. And it seems to suggest that political power only functions in the interest of what we would call political violence. And I think in many ways, nationalism in a world in which people are utterly connected is a kind of poison that prevents international solidarity. It prevents international dialogue. It prevents a collective struggle for justice. And in a way is almost always functions in the interest of a very restricted international ruling economic and militarized class.
Yeah, that we understand. And historically, Bangladeshi young people have been central to the democratic struggles. How can young people resist cultural authoritarianism or fascism?
Well, I think, first of all, young people, more than my generation, in some way recognize that culture is a site of struggle, and that how people think, how they understand themselves, how they relate to others has to be seen as a crucial element of politics. And it has to be understood that education is central to politics. So I think that young people have an obligation to basically open up spaces of translation, to create alternative public spheres, to bridge the gap between everyday life and politics, to make power visible in terms of how it works. And they need a language of hope, not just critique. They need a language of imagined futures, and they need, and this is very, very important, young people need to work collectively to enter into the public sphere in every way they can, through every element of social media. They need to talk to people in a language they can understand, that in some way resonates with their needs. Language is the vehicle through which we imagine ourselves, through which we understand ourselves, and through which we basically relate to others. So this struggle over language, this struggle over power, being held accountable, is always a struggle over culture. The old saying that politics follows culture is more important now than ever, because if you don't understand the problem, you can't address it. It's as simple as that. So we have to understand that the fight for individual and public culture is also a fight for civic literacy. It's a fight for civic understanding, and it's a fight for creating the foundation for collective resistance.
Thank you very much, Professor Henry. So you are saying that politics follows culture. At the same time, how do you, the religion is also very much part of the culture, right?
Yeah.
So there is no option that we can ignore religion and we can keep that apart, from the culture. When we talk about culture, the religion is very much part of it.
I don't think you can separate religion at all from questions of culture. I think that's a myth. I think that religion plays often both in oppressive and in emancipatory ways a very fundamental role in creating how people think about power, how people think about justice. I mean, how people think about the world they want to live in that eliminates poverty, staggering inequalities, suffering, militarization, and injustice. So I think that there's a spiritual element of all religions that in different ways speak to the public good and speak against oppression. And those elements of religion have to be celebrated. While it seems to me those other elements of religion tied basically to domination, the suppression of critical thinking, the suppression of agency, and the cult of even religious leadership need to be questioned and challenged.
So it seems that even in many religions also, there is a fascist element in the religious practice as well, sometime.
Oh,
right?
Absolutely. I mean, look, if you look at the theocratic movements that have come out of Latin America, which are very progressive and claim that women should not be treated as subordinates, that claim that basically the church is a stepping stone to address social injustice, not a place that organizes power in ways that suggest that politics is something we should ignore, or to suggest that people shouldn't fight for solidarity, or that injustice, if you're ready for this, is separate from religion. It's never separate from religion, whether religion wants to reproduce it or whether it wants to address it in ways that suggest that Allah, God, or some other spiritual entity, in the best sense, is always a symbol for understanding a world where injustice can be addressed and eliminated. That's a spiritual moment. That's a moment of moral cleansing. That's a moment in which we realize that all of our activities, religious and otherwise, has to be linked in some way to an understanding of the larger society, nationally and globally, in which justice has a spiritual element to it, a spiritual calling.
Thank you very much. So when we talk about culture, we always think about the writers, artists, painters, educators. So, and you have argued in your articles that culture can also be the site of resistance.
Right.
So, how or what can artists, writers, educators in Bangladesh, particularly, or any other part of the world, can do to challenge authoritarian control? What
think
would be their role?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I think that writers, artists, and various other cultural workers need to use the tools that basically mark how they operate, how they function, and use those tools to speak to people in a language they can understand. Create as many alternative sites for public narratives, alternative social media sites in which they can address enormously wide audiences. I think that they need to use the cultural realm and the realm of ideas as critical sites for expanding knowledge, expanding modes of critique, speaking to people in a language they can understand, and learning about the nature of oppression that people experience. Artists are not there to simply inform other people. Artists are there to basically understand in dialogue with other people how their tools can be used as part of a larger struggle to make democracy work, to make it real, to make it felt, to make it breathe, to make it in some way both an artistic, a pedagogical, and an intellectual calling.
So they have a very important role to play, in fact.
I think that artists are the pedagogical angels of the 21st century.
Okay.
I think that, yes.
So beyond intellectuals, artists, or educators, or activists, how can ordinary citizen practice what you call pedagogy of resistance?
I think that what people have to do is address two issues that are fundamentally important to fascist regimes. I think they have to recognize that, first of all, they're not alone. That we have, under fascist regimes, we're constantly taught that all problems are individual problems or problems of character. So we have to learn to, in some way, connect private troubles to larger systemic considerations. Secondly, we have to understand that economic activity, political activity, social activity, in some way has to be linked to questions of justice and social responsibility. Thirdly, we have to fight collectively, and we have to do it around a notion of solidarity that brings different groups together in ways that allows them to create, as young people in Bangladesh did, a mass movement for which power all of a sudden becomes threatening, collective, and informative.
You said that when fascist rulers, they are doing their work, a citizen should not feel alone. They should feel that there are some other parties. But the unfortunate part of in such situation, they don't feel ownership to any democratic institutions, the media. It looks like that they all are working in favor of the fascist power.
I think that's where culture becomes a struggle, right? I think that the task of any emancipatory group, whether it's young people or others, has to convince people that you can't normalize this, that these are that the forms of fear, the forms of oppression, the forms of militarization, the forms of ideology that fascist groups basically produce, whether in controlling the media or controlling schools or controlling other sources of public narrative, have to be challenged. That resistance is not simply something that's a sideshow. It's absolutely crucial to how we live if we want to live in a democracy and if we want to fight authoritarianism.
Authoritarian regimes now use, as you said, you mentioned just a few minutes ago, that they use technology, surveillance to suppress oppositions. So how can independent media is a very important role to play in democratic environment. So how independent media can play, or grassroots movements can push back this effectively?
Look, first of all, I think that there's an educational challenge here that we have to address. And that is, it's not enough to educate young people to be cultural critics. They have to be educated to be cultural producers. They have to learn how to run radio stations. They have to learn how to basically use the media. They have to learn code. We live in a world where the media is controlled by basically 5 powers in almost every country, or by one. And so it seems to me we have to be able to use those tools to create as many sites of resistance in the social media as we can, whether they're underground, whether they're done by radio, whether they're done by zines, whether they're done on the internet. But the internet is not controllable. in the way in which people often think. Even if it's shut down in one country, people have access to in others. But I think that what young people and artists have to do is expand the spaces of possibility through which people can learn a different language, to which they can hold power accountable, to which they can be informed, so they can learn something meaningful in order to be critical, in order to be transformative.
Yeah, I think this is the experience we have seen, at least in Bangladesh, in recent time during the student uprising, because when there was no space, everything was blocked by the fascist regime. The young people, they have become quite innovative, and they have discovered new things to create new space so that they can keep going.
They not only created new spaces in order to talk to each other, they created spaces that the dominant regime couldn't control.
That's right. They
created those spaces, and not simply as critical modes of information. They created those spaces in order to organize, and they brought the government down.
Yeah.
I mean, this is if you can do that in Bangladesh, if you can do that in Serbia, if you can do what's happening in Italy with direct action and massive strikes, there is power in solidarity, and there is power in learning how to break the machine. We have to break the machine culturally, politically, organizationally, collectively. It can be done. History teaches us that these regimes do not last long. They're too oppressive. They benefit the upper 0.1%. That can only go on for so long. It may be more difficult in this age of cultural domination, but at the same time, we are now seeing, in a time of a massive historical transformation, young people all over the world who are finding new tools of resistance, new modes of organization, and are creating new social movements that are not just national, they're international. They learn from each other.
Definitely. Do you think that how do you see that in Bangladeshi cultural authoritarianism as a part of the global trend, the same trend, or Bangladesh has done something very unique or different?
I think that what Bangladesh has done with the youth movement is to teach the rest of the world that resistance is possible, even in the most oppressive of regimes. I mean, what I see going on in the United States, which is really an abysmal slide into fascism. I mean, we have a president in the United States, the most powerful person in the world, who basically appears before all the top military brass in the United States and says, now we have to basically use the military to control cities. Can you imagine? And that alone should spark an uprising of enormous importance. And I think that what we need to realize is that we need to move away from liberalism. We need to move away from the assumption that capitalism and democracy are the same thing. They are not the same thing. I think what we need to begin to talk about is democratic socialism. We need a system in which human needs are far more important than profit, in which the democratization of everyday life is a central element. Everybody should have free education. Everybody should basically have a minimum wage. A universal wage. There never should be any poverty in these countries. Everybody should have health care. Everybody should have child care. There's enough wealth in the world to do that. In any country that claims that the wealth at the top has been earned through hard work, or has been earned through having some kind of eugenicist sense of privilege, is nonsense. And we've got to be able to address these myths.
So what you just said, that was the spirit of the youth-led July revolution in Bangladesh in 2024, in fact. Right. So they did not want any kind of discrimination. They said, right, we want a society without any discrimination. That's how can
you talk about a democracy that says you have to have discrimination?
Yeah.
There is no democracy. There is no democracy with patterns of hierarchy and exclusion based on race, ethnicity, or religion. That's nonsense. And I think that what we have seen all over the world in the fascist playbook is an attempt to basically return to a language of racial cleansing, ethnic exclusion, the hatred of refugees, for instance, the hatred of those who are deemed other, the reclamation of citizenship based on white nationalism often, These are all patterns of inequality. They're all patterns of exclusion that are against even the most fundamental notion of democracy. Look, take Orban in Hungary. He says he doesn't believe in democracy, and that he believes in illegal democracy. And they asked him why. And he said, the reason I don't believe in democracy is because I don't believe in mixed races. Can you imagine? I mean, what he's saying is, I don't believe in racial equality. We have seen this script before, and it leads to the camps. It leads to concentration camps. It leads to prisons. It leads to a punishing state. This is the language of dehumanization, the language of violence, and the language of basically what I would call policing thugs. That's the language of thuggery. That's all that is.
That's right. So we are quite close to the end part of our program, but let me just touch upon two important things. One is that even after July Revolution back home in Bangladesh in 2024, so now we see the cultural fascism. There is a rise in cultural fascism. So do you have any particular message to the people like writers, educators, poets, artists, what role they can play particularly during this time?
I think that they have an enormous role to basically do everything they can to describe a present that should not replicate the future. They have an enormous opportunity to, in some way, begin to celebrate something that's been missing from Bangladesh's history, and that is recent history, surely, in the last whatever years here, the importance of democracy and the need to fight for it. Democracy is not a final stage. It's an unfolding stage. It's never finished. It demands hard work intellectually, politically, in terms of organizing and social movements. And I think it seems to me where the artists and the intellectuals have an enormous role is creating the formative culture that makes that struggle possible. That's the issue.
And finally, if you had one message for young people in Bangladesh facing cultural fascism, what would it be?
Learn to live standing up rather than on your knees. Embrace the future as struggle and hope, and always imagine that domination is never so powerful that it can extinguish resistance.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we are very happy that you have mentioned Bangladeshi youth have shown if they are united, if the solidarity is there, so they can do anything and they can really establish democracy and at least help establishing democracy, right?
Absolutely.
So if you have anything, the last message or something to share for Bangladeshi youth or Bangladeshi people in relation to this.
I think what I would say is this. I would say there is no struggle without hope, and there is no agency without hope. And I'm not talking about Disney hope. I'm talking about a militarized hope that recognizes the obstacles that prevent people from living a life of dignity and justice. And young people, it seems to me, are in a position to make that difference.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Henry, and thank you very much, viewers, those who are watching our show and those who will be watching this show later on. I really appreciate your time and insight that you have shared with us today, Professor Henry. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me.